So anyway, what was I saying? So the superficial similarity to the something that Andy Warhol might do is telling in a certain way, just because it's I'm not necessarily an Andy Warhol fan, but I do like his technique. I much more admire the surrealists, and so if you took a look at the progression from the surrealists, my hero being Max Ernst, if you take a look at the progression from Max Ernst to the abstract expressionists to the pop artist, a lot of the mistake that people make in explaining that history is they look at the high point figure that's distinctly different. So they might look at Dali as the example of the surrealist, or they might look at Jackson Pollock as the lone example of the abstract expressionist, or they might look at Andy Warhol as the lone example of the pop artist. There's a much more gradual sort of overlap between them that makes that particular progression from one to the other. There's a lot more similarity between them than that sort of isolation of the high point figures would really make you think. Cameo by another cat. This is Bo. Say hi to the audience, Bo. So you see a lot of similarities. You see, if you look at a Max Ernst who's using all of the different styles, you'll see some abstract expressionism, and you'll see some pop art just in Max Ernst. You won't necessarily see that in Dali, but you certainly will. I mean, in some cases, Dali did have a lot of variety. But one thing that really defines Dali, and Max Ernst as a hero of mine in particular, was seeking new techniques to create new effects. And part of the reason for that is older techniques, the effect wears off, and the more and more some sort of similar technique comes up. And for me personally, if you look at a lot of abstract expressionism, it's very intense sort of stuff. This sort of stuff is highly influenced by abstract expressionists. Whenever I describe how the much more pure color-based stuff works, I tend to reference the abstract expressionist. But it's doing what the surrealists were doing, and a lot of the early surrealist painters were essentially abstract expressionists. Andre Masson, for example, is a perfect example of that. A lot of the Juan Moreau stuff. Not a huge difference between that and the abstract expressionists, because they were accessing that gut level response and saying, what sort of technique could we use in order to access that the total irrational gut level response. Painters like Dali used definite clear images. If you compare Dali and an Andre Masson or a Juan Moreau, they certainly don't look a lot alike. But what connects them is, in the sense that they're surrealists, is that they're aiming for access to the subconscious, which is the most important thing for a surrealist. The abstract expressionists are doing that through much more pure forms, getting rid of actual depictions of things. So if you just looked at Dali as the only example of a surrealist, you might say, abstract expressionists are radically different, because they're not depicting pictures of people, or melting clocks famously. Dali has better pictures than that one, but they're not depicting something. They're depicting the pure access to their subconscious impulses and their gut level reactions. But there's transitional figures that sometimes get forgotten. Like Arshil Gorky was a surrealist and doing surrealism, and then became an abstract expressionist doing abstract expressionism, and he was doing basically the same thing. But it was hailed as a new movement because it was accessing those gut level responses using a new technique, supposedly new technique. But for me, if I look at a lot of abstract expressionism, it loses the effect because a lot of it ends up looking the same. There's certainly a radical distinction between a Rothko and a Jackson Pollock or something like that, but if so many people are doing it that it starts to become essentially the same, and that's why a lot of people just in this simplified version of art history, they'll highlight Andy Warhol was just all of a sudden radically different. But then if you look at a transitional figure like Robert Rauschenberg, for example, he was doing a lot of stuff that you would call abstract expressionist. He was doing a lot of stuff that was pop art, and a lot of people were in that transitional phase. But this goes back a lot to my heroism of Black Mountain College, where they were experimenting in a lot of that living art, moment by moment, creating it from found materials also. I mean, that's a lot of what goes into Rauschenberg, who was a student there, and who was learning from some of the great abstract expressionists like Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein, people like that. And so he's using found materials, things in the everyday world, and what he had around him, and discovering things in the moment. Same sort of thing that Max Ernst was doing, discovering new techniques based on just things he had around him. Different ways to access that gut level response, but ultimately what tied all of them together was that gut level. How do you access that emotional intensity through a new technique? By avoiding also mechanical repetition, and that's really how I characterize the issue. So, for example, if you look at a lot of abstract expressionism, loses a lot of the effect because of mechanical repetition. But you can gain a lot of effect through organic repetition. So, what I would say is most important in creating an art piece, and my main field is fiction, and so that's what I'm interested in fiction also, is not necessarily what's right and wrong, but the thresholds that work for you. So the threshold between organic repetition, mechanical repetition, how much repetition creates that visceral gut level effect, and at what point does that repetition become mechanical and lifeless. So the rule of threes, for example, you can see three things in there. The rule of threes is effective because the repetition is organic, the way that in organic life you'll see repetition. And so if something repeats once, it could be coincidence, but if something repeats a third time, there's some indication that there's life behind it, or some intention, some natural progression. And that's why I call it organic repetition. The more and more that repeats, it becomes mechanical repetition, so it loses the effect. Part of what makes Andy Warhol so effective in his use of repetition is that it's a huge contrast to the abstract expressionists, using materials that were deemed forbidden, lowly or what have you, repeating them, and that sort of level of repetition was considered forbidden, but it was radically new compared to what came before. I'm not an art historian. This is just my personal meditation on it. This is not my field of expertise, just my personal meditation on it. So I do like that kind of repetition. The big groups of threes and that sort of thing. But I would avoid the full-on mechanical repetition. Because I mean, a lot of the reasons why I like Warhol's technique is it can create an effect, but a lot of the Warhol stuff, it doesn't really do the job for me the way that, you know, a Max Ernst piece might. Trying to think of what else I want to say. So yes, the thresholds being the most important thing. The idea that you're not necessarily, what's most important is not necessarily a rule system so much as recognizing thresholds. Like, for example, here's another threshold. This is what I was going to say. Familiarity and novelty. The threshold between familiarity and novelty, that's one of the most significant thresholds in creating any sort of art form. So if you're creating a fiction piece, if you're creating a story, the old lie is rate what you know, which is complete nonsense. But recognition of where to best balance what's familiar, which can conceivably create an effect. So, you know, seeing something familiar creates what I would call a framing effect. Is similar to that, the rule of threes, in that repetition can create an effect. You can create the effect of recognition of, you know, life being intrinsic to this repetition of three or more, or what have you. But familiarity by its very nature is unengaging to the gut level instinct. So you recognize something and you have a gut level response, but there's a limited amount of effect to just pure familiarity. So you have to balance that off with unfamiliarity or novelty of some sort. And the degree to which the familiarity meets the unfamiliarity is really purely determined by the writer or the artist. Just the level to which the unfamiliarity and the familiarity, the novelty or the familiarity, really mixes. So, you know, having something familiar like the image of Superman creates the sense of recognition that that's Superman, but the fact that he's repeated 3 times makes it unfamiliar, coincidentally, even though it's verging on mechanical repetition. The actual repetition of Superman 3 times creates an unfamiliarity. So the surrealist technique, the dislocation, comes from a very particular mix of the unfamiliar and the familiar. But all art will have some sort of mix of the unfamiliar and familiar. If it's purely familiar, it's going to be incredibly boring. It may have a certain, you know, just the familiarity itself may have a certain engaging quality to it. If it's a human being, for example, it engages in just the natural empathetic response to the human being. So just depicting a human being, you know, with some sort of emotional expression is going to just intrinsically have some sort of effect. But there should be something just in my taste, there should be something all for quirky or interesting or unfamiliar. I skew much more towards the unfamiliar side. I'm much more fond of things that are unfamiliar than things that are familiar. But it's, you know, just purely up to the writer, purely up to the reader. Trying to think of what else I wanted to say at this point. Let's see.